We're happy that technology is working in our favor today, and I want to thank the CCAC members that have dialed in. We're very happy to be able to offer these virtual member meetings. We know that they're not the same as our normal lunches, but it does give us an opportunity to hear from experts and for your questions to be answered. So please remember that at the bottom of the Zoom screen, there is a Q&A button, and we encourage you to ask questions, and I will be sure to relay whatever you send in to us. So today we have two CCAC members as speakers and even a CCAC executive board member. So it is a great honor to welcome both Bob Chodos, who is the Vice Chairman of Newmark Knight Frank, and Matt Fiascone, who is the President of the Habitat Company. Welcome, gentlemen. How are you today?
Thank you. Very well.
Well, I know that we are here to discuss residential and commercial real estate in a new COVID world. I know that there is a lot of uncertainty, but I know that our members are really interested in hearing from kind of what your current experiences are, as well as asking you to look in a crystal ball and give us some ideas of what you think the future may hold. So let's start with Matt. Matt, if you could first share if there's anything in regard to your background. I know that you have led a number of real estate development and investment activities for over 30 years, and that you are really in charge of the vision and growth of the Habitat Company. So we know that you have a long history of being involved with capital investments, joint ventures, recapitalization of existing ventures and acquisitions. So I guess just to set the stage, would you like to share with the audience a little bit about your background and then kind of let us know what you think about the residential real estate market?
Sure. Thank you, Kelly. Well, I'm a lifelong Chicagoan. I think that's most appropriate with this group. And I've spent my entire career, professional career, in the real estate world in the Chicago metro area. A large part of it before Habitat in fact, all of it before Habitat with the Inland Real Estate Group of companies based in Oak Brook. And then since 2011 at Habitat. I think it's an overestimate to say I lead anything. We have a great team, and they do all the heavy lifting, and they deserve all the credit for that. The Habitat
Matt,
Company.
I do have to tell you that I concur. You do have a great team, and that you have been so good to CCAC. And I do want to give a shout out to Steve Galler, who also sits on the board. And there's so many on your team that are involved with the Burnham Council and several of our projects. So I absolutely concur. You do have a fabulous team.
Thank you. It's always good to be affirmed. The Habitat Company, for those who don't have a big knowledge base on us, have been around for almost 50 years. Next year will be our 50th anniversary as an entity. And we like to think that our distinguishing feature is that we run the full gamut of residential housing. And by that, I mean, we are involved in either an operating basis or a development basis, an ownership basis, on everything from public housing all the way to the highest end residential properties in Chicago and in the markets we work. We're Midwest, primarily a Midwest regional owner operator. We do have a small platform down in Central Florida, but Chicago is our home. It is the most important market to us. The majority of our team members are here. The majority of our properties are here, and we're fully invested in the future of it and in lifting up the city to the extent that we can. I think not to bury the lead, but I think what we're going to hear today is that there are a lot of commonalities between the residential world that I'm going to speak primarily to and the commercial world that Bob will speak primarily to, and the factors operating in large part with COVID are impacting us in very similar ways. And while there are some dissimilarities or differences, the similarities are greater, and the synergies, the energy between them will either make or break us coming out of this medically induced financial crisis. I'm not really adept at sharing screens, but I'm going to try. I have a few slides. And what I'd like to walk you through here really briefly is the current status of, and I might be able to do this. Okay, is that up there?
Yes, very good.
Okay, I succeeded. It's the current status of our portfolio here in Chicago. And the point I'm trying to illustrate here is that in the media and in the business, specifically in the real estate business, we've all been focused on the percentage of rent that we're collecting, either from our commercial tenants or in our case, from our residents. And I think what we're finding out here, I actually know the conclusion that I've come to is that that's the wrong metric.
Hey, Matt, we might want to set the screen a little differently. It's you can't see the full screen.
Okay.
At least I can't. I don't know if Kelly, if you're having the same issue.
You know, I think that this is
any better?
the way that
Yeah.
Zoom
much
works
better.
with the speakers, but let's see. You know, I think one question is we see that 2019, you know, we see the, but then the blue line for 2020. Matt, maybe you can help us understand what that blue line is.
Yeah, I'm going to walk through it really quickly here. So what I've done, there's three charts, and what I've done with all of them is that I've focused it solely on our Chicago portfolio, and I've done what we call a same-store sales approach. So these are the same buildings in 2019 and 2020. The orange bars are 2019 data. The blue line in this case is 2020 data for the same set of buildings. And this is the percentage of rent collected. What that is we bill out a certain amount of rent at the beginning of every month, and by the end of the month, and this is end of month data, what percentage of that billed out we collected. And you can see that we historically have very strong collections. In March of 2019, it exceeded 96%, and in March of 2020, we were over 97%. So we actually collected a higher percentage of total rent in March 2020 than we did in March 2019. And that makes sense because the pandemic really didn't hit us here in terms of people losing their jobs and being confined to their homes until the middle of March. Then in April, we move on, and we're both about 95.5% collected, 2019 and 2020. 2020 still slightly higher. And then in May, we start seeing the full impact, and collections do drop, but not anywhere near what any of us in the business anticipated. So we were about 96.5% collected in May of 2019, and just under 95% collected, or 1.5% left less in May of 2020. And then June, a little bit more erosion, about similar collections in June of 2019 as we had in May of 2019, and about similar collections in June 2020 as May 2020, but still about 1.5% less of total. So I think what you're going to see is that it's not really the percent collected that's making a difference in our business right now. What it is that occupancy is declining. And to explain that, we have to realize that Chicago is a seasonal market, especially in the residential world. Most apartments are leased between April and September, with a heavier concentration in the summer months. And very few apartments, conversely, in November to March. And that also means that most leases expire in those prime leasing months, April to October, or April to September. And what we are seeing is that psychologically people were committed to paying their rent. They felt either a moral or ethical obligation, because we know that there wasn't the ability to evict them. So they could have deferred. And by and large, they had either enough savings or received enough money from the stimulus payments and unemployment insurance for those who lost their jobs to be able to get through. But what they did see is that, well, my lease is expiring in the next, pick a month, 1, 2, 3 months, because that's the end of the lease term. And so I'm going to pay until then, and then I am going to end my lease and not renew. And so here you can see on the next slide that occupancy is declining at a faster rate than percent collected. Again, March, April, May, June, orange is 2019, blue is 2020. And I think there are 3 main reasons for this, or 3 broad categories of the typical resident that's vacating. One is that they're more common, what we think of as the more common apartment dweller demographic. So people from post-college to low 30s. They, in large part, are finding a roommate or additional roommates to lower their rent cost on a monthly basis, or they're moving home with their parents. So those are 2, doubling up or moving home. And there is not a new batch of college graduates coming into the market because they don't have jobs yet because of the COVID era. And so we're not able to replace those tenants who either double up and vacate apartments or move home with their parents. And then the third category, and this is unique to what we have had in this cycle, say post Great Recession, we've had a significant number of people who are empty nesters. I can identify myself as in this category, where they've typically lived in the suburbs, their kids have now moved out of the house, and they want to try downtown living. And the way they tried downtown living was to rent a really nice apartment. And these are all generalizations, but as we know, there's truth in generalizations. So in general, they were not price sensitive tenants. They went down, they picked out the absolute nicest apartment they could find, and they rented it. They didn't really care what the price was. They wanted to be in the building they wanted to be. And their leases also expire typically in the high season or the best leasing season. And so as they came to the end, it wasn't necessarily that they needed to double up or move back home with their parents because they were the parents, but they saw now confined for a number of weeks or months to a much smaller space than what they were used to. And then they also experienced the inability to enjoy the outside, not only because of COVID, but the violence we had over a few weekends. And they are now choosing to move back to the suburbs. And that can best be displayed in the third slide, which shows collected rents. So this is a combination of percent collected and the amount of rent in gross dollars that we're getting. And here you can see an even more steep decline. The orange line, again, 2018, the blue line, 2019. And what you would normally expect is that the 2020 line would be always higher than the 2019 line to account for rent increases that occur almost every year. But as we can see, real rents are declining. The 100% line here is March of 2019. And so the 2019 line goes up predictably as it would during the course of the year, rents slightly increasing month over month. March of 2020 were significantly higher than March of 2019, and then we breached that. And as you can see, between May and June, we're headed in a steeper decline in the gross income that we're collecting. So that's the picture today in residential real estate. We can get into more of the whys and what the future holds as we progress here, but I'm going to pass the baton to Bob here to take over.
Well, thank you, Matt. And I do have some questions. So after Bob is able to share his thoughts on commercial, then we'll do a conversation and again, invite the audience to submit questions. So Bob, thank you for your leadership on the CCAC board. I know that you are really heralded as a person to go to for ground up development process advice and that you specialize in real estate brokerage and advisory. You've listened to what Matt has to say, and he mentioned that he thought that there was a lot of similarities in the commercial real estate arena. Do you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I would. There's a primary difference, and that is the cycle times on leases in the real estate industry are 15 times or 10 times longer than the residential side. The year-to-year leases in the multifamily side is the norm, and in our business, they range from 5, 10, and often 15 or 20 years in length. So people in the occupiers or users of real estate in any marketplace are faced with big capital decisions that are long standing, impacting decisions to their business, because once a lease is in place, very hard to get rid of it. Just by brief way of background, like Matt, I call Chicago my home. It's I haven't been home here for my entire life, just the best part of my life, the 35 years I've spent here living in Chicago, working and raising a family. So we call Chicago our home today. But I come from the East Coast, upstate New York, Saratoga Springs, went to school in the Northeast, and even spent a time in Colorado before I moved to Chicago to go to work with Wes Irvine, who was a partner with John Buck at his company. And ultimately, I was with John Buck for 15 years. And then before joining Newmark with Colliers International for 11, and been with Newmark now for just over 4. And we provide global real estate advisory consulting services on both the investor side and the occupier side. So it's tenant rep on both sides, landlord rep on the investor side. It's industrial, retail, hospitality, data centers. I mean, a broad spectrum of skill sets, and we provide project and property management, facilities management globally, and a high level of consulting in lots of different areas. My area of discipline is occupier services. I represent tenants and have had a pretty good run in Chicago, having a lot of work with some of the best tenants in the market, some of which are in this room today, which I'm thankful for. But I'm going to take you through sort of a quick overview of the marketplace so you understand that and where we were pre-COVID. And then I want to show you a little bit about what we think is happening with the impact of COVID on the leasing market. So Chicago, just by way of background, is kind of divided into these buckets. You have the River North Marketplace, North Michigan Avenue, Streeterville Medical Center, a lot of residential here. East Loop, which includes a lot of great residential in this zone. Millennium Park, obviously, the barrier, everything in green is the public lands that makes Chicago a great city, because our lakefront belongs to the public. The Central Loop, big center, was historically the center of the universe, but most of the development has migrated into the West Loop today, and there's a whole new market, Fulton Market, and running up the river now towards Lincoln Yards, the Tribune sites, the expansion of the natural progression of the market north, and there's properties developing to the south, the 78 and the Michael Reese sites and other large scale developments. Just to give you a background, I mean, the market in 2019 was 142 million square feet of space in these zones, A, B, and C office. Today, that's now at 144, and it's heading closer to 145 with new developments going on in the marketplace. And our vacancy is trended, it has been tightening over the last cycle, the last 10 years. It stood at 13.7 a year ago. Today, it's at first quarter of this year was at 13.5, and it's rising now to 13.7. That's an overall vacancy of that 142 million square feet. There are reports out by other firms that have that pegged at even 15%. And this is the sort of the canary in the coal mine that's starting to emerge in our market. And I'll sort of preface everything about what's happening in Chicago is that, on March 9th, which was my last day that I was in my office, we were in the strongest market in the 4 cycles I've lived through in Chicago. Literally, more development happening, rents rising at fairly dramatic rates. I mean, we went from rents that didn't crest $30 net in new buildings to rents that went as high as $50 net in the last cycle. And some of the new buildings coming online, like Wolf Point, buildings like 150 Riverside, 444 West Lake, the new 320 Canal, these buildings are all going to we're commanding on that date rents in the high 30s to mid 40s across the board in their buildings. The 110 North Wacker, for example, B of A's building is almost fully leased, and it hasn't even opened yet. So the market was at its healthiest point we have ever seen in the 35 years that I've been, or 36 years now that I've been doing this. So that just gives you sort of a backdrop of where we were. I won't go market by market other than to say the emerging markets here, like the Fulton market, is really growing very quickly. There's 4.5 million feet there today. There could be 10 million feet there very quickly. Again, pre-COVID, we'll see what happens in post-COVID. And that, the kinds of development, things under construction today in 20, you can see a very large host of buildings that are actually being built, 2021 deliveries, and then 22 deliveries, and then 23 potential, new deliveries. These are actually, going in the ground as we speak. 450 Dearborn and 360 Green are not active yet, but Wolf Point is actually broken ground. So there's a whole lot of, there's a great pipeline of new product that is set to come to market or might be put on hold. And you can see the geography of it is mostly in the Fulton Market corridor and the West Loop on and around the river. Just to give you a little backdrop, tech firms over the last, since 2015, over 8.4 million square feet of tech firms have come downtown to Chicago, and they're all over the downtown market. So they're kind of agnostic to the spaces they want to be in. Their employees tend to be younger. They reside near the L's, and so having these firms in the central loop is actually a very good sign. In 2019, we had 1.6 million square feet of tech leases signed. Year to date, there was going to be a very large development for Google that has been sort of put on hold out in Fulton Market at this time. And so I think the good news is that tech found Chicago. The maybe not so good news is that's a part of the industry. Certain aspects of that industry have been seeing a lot of layoffs. So it's yet to be seen. And one of the other great stories that was underway for the last 4 or 5 quarters has been the migration of many companies down to the central core because of its access to public transportation, better lifestyle, labor, low-cost housing compared to other regional marketplaces. And you can see that since 2019, we've had a massive move of some of the biggest names in the marketplace to the downtown market from the suburbs. It will be interesting to see what happens going forward under the new sort of COVID regime. Subleases are always a canary in the coal mine, a bellwether for what's happening. You'll see that over, during the World Trade Center event, we had a massive drop in terms of demand for space. We had a big spike in subleases, and then it peeled off over the ensuing 6 to 7 years. It rose again in 2019, in 2009 when we had the financial crisis, and went through a couple gyrations, and it's been pretty steady since since 2020 and today. But now we've got a slight rise happening. What's not in these numbers yet are any of the layoffs that really start to happen in a big way. With one we've heard a lot about is Willis Tower and United Airlines, and whether they really downsize their employee base. And we won't know a lot about that until October, when some of those events have been scheduled to start to happen. But to date, we've added a couple million feet of space to the market. So at 140 million square foot downtown market, still not a real, red flag flying yet, but the trend line is moving up. And then just on the layoffs we've seen, this just summarizes pretty briefly. You can see we're in a big spike of layoffs, and not in these numbers are anything that might be happening with United or others. So I think it's yet to be seen where the data points start to fall. And then on investment sales, these are the investment sales from 2018, 2019, much smaller. And there's only been 2 since, or in the window of COVID. And one was the Mondelez site on the West Loop, which sold for a record high, I think $897 a square foot. And then Spear Street Capital purchased 225 Wacker for around $323 a square foot. So, a fully leased investment grade, tenant in the market building is going to command a cap rate of sub 5%. A building in the marketplace with vacancy and with, an existing tenant base is going to have a whole different characteristic. So what I wanted to share with you also is, and I hope this screen showed up. Did it, Kelly?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So the question we get all the time is what's going on with rents? You know, what's happening? And the landlords we negotiate with will say nothing's going on with rents. They're fine. They're holding steady. Concessions are falling. Well, and the fact is nothing has happened yet. There are no data points. Since COVID hit, there have been virtually 2 or 3 leases in the downtown market signed that I'm aware of. And so from 2001, when the World Trade Center happened, and this is for A-class space, about 11 million square feet in downtown Chicago, we saw, you know, face rents that were, combined rents. The net rents were at $24.39. Tax and operating expenses were at $14.40 a square foot combined. So gross rents were in the $39 range. We saw a modest pullback, even though that was a pretty catastrophic event. Saw a modest pullback in rents, and then things sort of stabilized and continued to decline. This is a story I'm going to talk about in a second, by the way. This is tax and operating costs in Chicago. And you'll see as a percentage of rents, they start to get pretty high. In the financial crisis, the fall off was quite dramatic. And you can see that rents were at $28.50 with combined 26, they fell from 28 to 26 on average, with taxes and operating at 1770. So combined 46 down to 44. We saw in various tiers of the market much stronger pullbacks. These are average costs. So it all depended on whether it was high view space in a good location, desirable area near the trains, et cetera. But generally speaking, we saw 12 to 15% pullback in these costs. Then we've been on a run like none before, been going up steadily in all 3 buckets: rents, tax and operating costs, and total gross rents. And what we don't know is what's going to be the impact of COVID-19. So we overlay this with a supply and demand characteristic, and the red bars are absorption, the gray bars are new supply. And you can see new supply that was contracted to come online in 2005 did, and then in 2010, when 353 North Clark and 300 North LaSalle came online, a big spike of supply came online, and we had a great absorption going out of that sector into the next ensuing 10 years. And we've had strong demand coming, you know, to the point where in 2019, we were over 2.5 million feet of net absorption. So that's on activity. It could be 5 to 6 million feet of transactions. In the first quarter, we had 400,000 square feet, and then absorption has stopped. And this is the scheduled supply hitting the marketplace. And so with vacancy, we can lay that in. You can see we came from, you know, a very high vacancy market, came down low. Then after the financial crisis, it spiked up high again, trending back down at very low. And right now, depending on whether we get positive, negative, or if you get negative, positive, or slightly strong growth, will trend whether vacancy numbers, you know, on the low end go to 17%, could go as high as 21. It's hard to say today because we have no data points, but there's certainly a belief that rents will be coming down, and probably meaningfully. Concession packages will be increasing, maybe meaningfully. They're fairly stiff today, to be honest with you. But what we just don't know is when this is going to happen. And so I think the key takeaway is it took 2 years after the financial crisis really hit to have a real understanding of where rents were going to settle out, where we're going to get some kind of capitulation where tenants and landlords actually start doing transactions again. And right now, that's kind of the world we're in. So the other 2 layers, I'll just for humor, these are the presidential election and employment numbers. And you can see how the presidential elections actually do cycle, interestingly, with vacancy, demand, and these events that have happened. We've enjoyed 3 cycles here for the last 10 years. There's a new election coming this year, and I think all bets are kind of off as to what the impact of this COVID crisis, coupled with the financial challenges that the state of Illinois is facing, and coupling that again with this issue of real estate taxes now and operating costs starting to approach similar numbers in other coastal markets like New York, Boston, and California. Our rents were never in the 60s, and we actually have rents today in new buildings that are in the 70s full service. And that's starting to approach coastal rents. Big reason why our costs and operating expenses and taxes have come up, and I think they're going to be continuing to come up. So that's a general overview of the state of the market. The conclusion is, unlike in the residential industry where we have data points happening quickly, we have none. And so it's yet to be seen where we're heading.
That's really very, very informative. And I'm already getting text messages from people saying that they're interested in these slides. So I know that this is quite an insight. Maybe you can.
I'll send you the wire transfer instructions for where you can buy them. No,
Got
I'm
it,
just
got
joking.
it. So
Just
you
joking.
could hit the end share screen so we could have a conversation.
Stop share. Yeah. Okay.
Matt, question for you in regard to the data that you showed. How is Habitat responding to the vacancy, growing and the rent collection lessening? What is your strategy for how to respond in real time?
So Bob is absolutely correct. We have a much shorter lease cycle, which has its advantages and its disadvantages.
Right.
One of the advantages is that we can always fill apartments up because we can just keep cutting the price until they fill. And another advantage of a short one is we're only stuck with that pricing for a year. In Bob's world, they're stuck with it for 10, 15, 20 years. And so the decision is much more difficult because it has long-term implications. So first thing we're doing is we're increasing our marketing efforts, and almost all that today involves some kind of digital means. Identifying potential residents is done digitally. Tours are done virtually today. Leasing is even signed without coming in the office. And so those are all evolving technologies that, quite frankly, our team is still getting used to, and that's not unusual in our industry. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to finding a price at which people will come into your building and rent. And some of that's concessions, one-time concessions. Some of it's just outright rent reductions to fill up the buildings.
And is that kind of across the board with all the buildings that you have in Chicago?
Well, that's a good question, because I said at the beginning that we're involved in the full spectrum of residential real estate. The data that I gave and most of the discussion that I'm having today relates solely to our market rate portfolio. If we showed similar data, and it doesn't compare apples to apples, but if I showed similar data for our affordable portfolio, you would see that collections and rents hold up much better there. But a large portion of those rents are government subsidies. And so clearly the US government is still continuing to pay its bills, thank the Lord. And so we're not as impacted there. And there's a huge shortage of affordable apartments, not just in Chicago and in every municipal area of the country. And so there is not an issue of refilling any apartment that goes vacant.
Approximately how many units or what percentage of affordable is in the Habitat portfolio?
So we currently have under management just over 23,000 residential units, and about almost 13,000 of those are affordable, so slightly more than half.
Great, thank you. We do have a question from the audience, and one of our CCAC members is asking Bob, what is the impact on concepts for amenity spaces in future major office projects?
That's a very good question. One of the biggest developments within our last two cycles has been the inclusion of very extensive amenity spaces, work cafes, very developed athletic facilities, not just a little small gym in the building, but an actual, often a half a floor or even 3/4 of a floor that would be related to an athletic workout and training space. The emergence of companies like Convene and obviously WeWork and Industrious and other co-working operations, which bring to buildings, large scale amenity facilities, restaurants in place, all these things. It's kind of been a war of amenities. And typically today in a new building, you're going to have a very established conference center that has breakout spaces for meetings and events, lots of rooms, very extensive technology, big workout space, restaurants, clubs. So with COVID happening, all of those things sort of stop because nobody's going to really be using them to the extent that they're intended. And so until we get a vaccine or until we get a really effective treatment protocol, we're going to be seeing that these spaces that have been built are going to be sitting rather idle for a while. And that's not to mean they're not going to be used, but you're going to have to employ very extensive social distancing in order to work out in these spaces and have a higher degree of management involvement in cleaning them and keeping them up to speed. I don't think they're going away because I think we will ultimately find a solution to this crisis and get a vaccine or get an effective treatment, and we will return to some state of normalcy. But I think that the crisis has taught our clients a lot about a new way of working. And the new way of working is that many people can be very successful working remotely. And as such, what is that going to mean? Do they come downtown at all? Do they work in a suburban hub and spoke concept? Do they come down to the city in order to have meetings with their coworkers and with customers and clients? And so I think the pendulum, like all the pendulums that swing in our industry, I mean, in January, February, March of 2020, major banks were planning spaces in new buildings at 125 square feet per seat. That's a metric we've seen. And those are going to grow to 250 square feet per seat simply by the need to distance people back out. No more benching, no more people sitting shoulder to shoulder. We're going to have to spread people out no matter what. And I think so the big driver on the whole question of amenity and use of real estate is going to come back to what are companies going to want to have as their footprint going forward, assuming that 25 or 30% of their daily workforce will be working remotely, coming into the office, maybe sitting in unassigned seats, meeting in collaboration spaces, using conference facilities or amenity spaces in ways that are productive. And I think overall the demand for space is going to be compressed to a degree, but it's going to be expanded to meet the social distancing. So net, we could have a 10 or 15% overall cut in demand. And this is excluding demand that goes away as a result of business failures. And we will see demand go away as a result of business failures in our marketplace.
And this is one of the areas where there is a commonality or a link between commercial and residential, because to the extent people work long-term from home and not in the city proper, the central business district, it impacts our residency incrementally, because a certain number of our residents live where they are because it's close to work and it minimizes their commute time. And to the extent they don't have that commute anymore or don't have to make that commute anymore, it allows them the freedom to move further out and maybe also in doing so address some of their virus fears.
I would add that the real impediments to reboarding businesses in the central business district is public transportation and elevators. And it's interesting, my wife and I flew to Colorado 3 weeks ago. All four of our legs were 100% sold out. Every seat on the planes occupied. Everybody wearing masks, but every seat occupied. And so you think about that. People are flying for 3-4 hours on an airplane, shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same air. And we think we need to space people in elevators for a 10 or 15-second ride for people alone in an elevator. The public transportation piece is harder to solve, but the vertical transportation piece, in my opinion, and I'm not a doctor, of course, I think we could be putting more people in elevators if they're wearing masks and not speaking. Your chances of catching it in an elevator with 6 people or 8 people compared to sitting on an airplane shoulder to shoulder are much lower, in my opinion. But again, these are the big challenges of reboarding office space, getting up in the buildings and getting downtown on public transportation.
Working at home has its challenges, and we have a UPS truck outside that's got the dog barking. So sorry for any background noise, trying to deal with that crisis. But saying that, what another question, and I do again encourage the audience to submit questions, but I'm curious, Matt, in terms of your property in Florida. Florida had a very different approach to COVID, didn't shut down the way Illinois did. And, now they're seeing record numbers, higher COVID cases than anything we've seen thus far here in the US. So what are you seeing in the Florida market? How does that compare to the Chicago market? Again, kind of based on the different approaches that the government leadership took.
I don't think the comparison is really a strong one, because the property we manage in Florida is actually a more suburban property that doesn't have the same impacts from COVID, and it actually is a series of freestanding duplexes that are all for rent, and that we can have a whole nother topic on suburban living versus urban living and the impact of a pandemic era on that. But it's really not a good comparison. Now, from a standpoint of team members, which, they're working in similar environments of having to meet with people, handle maintenance requests. We are getting a kind of a second wave, not to reuse a bad phrase, but a second wave of concern from team members in Florida that they're now going to be more exposed, similar to what we had in Illinois and Michigan and Minnesota, where we operate as well, 10 weeks ago. How do I keep myself safe? Should I still be required to come to work? Are we dealing with only emergency maintenance calls? Or so that kind of thing is recycling. But I feel like we met that challenge, and if and when it comes back again, we're going to be prepared this time. Last time was kind of meeting it on the fly and literally daily, sometimes multiple times a day, exchanging information of what's going on the ground and how one property addressed it, and could that be shared to another property as a means of handling a similar situation. And now we're unfortunately or fortunately prepared for the next time that happens. So.
Well, I'm sorry that you had to go through that, but it is, good that you now at least have a better sense of how to approach it, because it doesn't appear that we are out of the woods with the COVID situation. And I know there's a lot of fear that we're still only in phase 1, and that the fall could really be what would officially be termed a second wave. So we're all adjusting in real time. I see that we do have another question from the audience, and so let me read this. It's a question for both panelists, and it reads, I have seen articles and panels mention a move back to the suburbs. On the commercial side, the ability to have more office space and accommodate social distances. On the residential side, the ability to work from home more often. Can you both address a possible, quote, flight to the suburbs?
You want me to take that on first?
You start, Bob.
Okay. So we, in our office, we run a call every Monday, and we have the suburban and downtown teams, the people that are, in the leadership roles, and everybody who's working in the business development side get on call. And we just talk about this exact question. To date, we've yet to see a lot of activity in the suburbs of it. We've seen zero activity of companies changing direction and moving it back out of the city to the suburbs, like the migration. I showed you that slide of, none of those companies have been talking about moving out of the city. And we've not seen, large requests for space from big users downtown who want to set up satellites in the east-west corridor, O'Hare and North Shore marketplace. We've seen a little bit of, there have been inquiries for small offices, but the suburbs are right now as quiet as the downtown market is. The downtown market is seeing some activity, but it's very, very limited. And so I think the answer is, it's yet to be seen if companies will actually make that move to establish beachheads in the summer. And here's what I think the reason is. Many companies have come downtown and repositioned in the city, and they've spent enormous capital building out world-class space because it's a war for talent in our market, and real estate with good bones to it, good environment, technology, meeting rooms, furniture, all those things. They've spent a lot of money building that space out, and they're not going to easily layer on another long-term lease somewhere else and build another space somewhere else when they're going to have capacity in their existing facilities. And virtually everybody has capacity today because virtually everybody's had to furlough employees, or people are actually working remotely and doing so successfully. So while I think there's a lot of desire to maybe do that, I think the capital to do it is going to be scarce. And I think people are going to make do with what they have. They're going to allow teams of people to work remotely that feel safe. They'll bring people downtown when they're ready to bring them downtown, when there are medical services that are successful in treating COVID, and maybe a vaccine on the horizon, which we keep hearing early next year. But some of these vaccines will take 4 years to come to fruition. So we could be in for a really long haul here. And so I think the answer is yet to be seen on whether we're going to see a migration, substantial migration to the suburbs. But suburban rents are 60% of downtown rents, and you can spread out in a 4-story building and walk up without an elevator, and you can park in a parking lot that's at the building. And that's maybe what the game changer might be in the future.
Interesting. And Matt, what about, do you think that those empty nesters are coming back downtown?
I don't. And I also think that the reality of the move to the suburbs for residences in general is it's a very long-term shift in the pendulum that Bob spoke of earlier, for a couple reasons. One, the empty nesters, the pre-retirees and early retirees, I don't think will quickly return to the city, to urban living. And then you have the millennial generation, upon which a large part of the residential boom for this last cycle has been built. And we've all been waiting for their ultimate move to the suburbs to raise families. And now any one of them that was inclined to try to raise a family in the city has additional fears or impediments of apparently the increased risk for pandemic spread in a dense environment, increased violence on occasion, and on the positive side, a proven method of maintaining their lifestyle by working remotely. And so the draw to the suburbs, or maybe I should say the draw to stay in the city, is severely weakened. And I think that we're going to see increasing move to the suburbs for residences as a result of those factors. I hate saying that because our portfolio is highly urban centric, but we're going to have to adapt to that.
Yeah, I would also add on that just that, with the legislation afoot to do a graduated income tax, which looks like it's going to be brought to the House and looks like it has a high chance of being passed, coupled with real estate taxes that have skyrocketed in our marketplace. People may be moving from the city to other marketplaces instead of the suburbs. So, these are all really big issues that are challenging for the marketplace as a whole. I was on a call with several of my partners in Dallas and in the Houston and Austin markets 2 days ago, and they've said that they've seen an increasing number of companies from the north, particularly Illinois, investigating sites in Dallas, Houston, and Austin. And I think this is, until our legislators wake up and see what's really possibly going to happen, COVID, coupled with the violence, coupled with graduated income tax, coupled with taxes, these are big forces that could have a pretty negative impact on the marketplace. And so we're at an inflection point in reality. Hopefully, the attributes that make Chicago a place where Matt and I have set down roots and love to live, low cost of living, centralized location, water, which is critical, great housing, 220,000 employees living and graduating from some of the best universities in the world within 200 miles of our community. Those forces hopefully can offset some of these other issues, but we're at a real big inflection point, and it'll be very interesting to see what the next 2 to 3 years has to say for our region.
Sure. Matt, we have a question that came in for you. It reads, do you see a potential for demand of larger units as residents spend more time working and staying indoors?
Certainly there will be a segment that demands larger units. It's hard to deliver larger units because for so many years now, the apartment footprint has actually been shrinking, certainly not getting larger. And you can't turn on a dime, nor could you get financing for new buildings quickly. So I think more importantly is it's all about bandwidth. They have to be able to work from home as efficiently as they can from a suburban home or from their office. And retrofitting high-rise concrete and steel buildings for super high-speed access is not easy to do either, but needs to be done. And that's where I see money being spent rather than trying to make units larger. So
that's very, very interesting. I mean, we, in the report that CCAC published last year, a Central City Strategy for all of Chicago, we talked about pockets of the city that they don't have really, broadband bandwidth, and just trying to get the ability for the neighborhoods to have the ability to download job applications and different online classes. And so I know from my days living in the city that is and even in the office, it would be difficult. So that's really great that's on your radar screen, particularly for the core area, in addition, to the needs of the neighborhood.
Touching on the education
Those
too,
are great.
you have, if we're going to continue on with any type of learning remotely, you just exacerbate the need for high-speed access and lots of bandwidth. And that too is another impetus to the suburbs for people that have school-age children. So.
Do you have any associations or other real estate groups that you are a member that are tackling those issues?
What issues?
But the broadband, like needing the investment into the infrastructure. Is that a conversation that you're hearing?
I'm hearing it from a lot of owner operators, but not as a collective move. I don't know that it's a government solution, if that's what you're asking. I think it has to be private investment. Each individual building is going to have to find a way to provide it. 5G may also offer some ways to do that too, but also not for free.
Mm-hmm. Right. And Bob, speaking of kind of what you're hearing, one member is asking, in regard to outdoor spaces, are you hearing any creative solutions to how to create more outdoor spaces but deal with the Chicago weather?
The weather, okay. Well, I'll take that in two pieces. I mean, on the outdoor space side, most buildings today are putting in, if they can, balcony spaces up in the towers, top of the building. I've seen a design from one of the developers, Hines in Chicago, for a building that they're scoping out that is really unique. It's very, very progressive. It has balcony spaces in multiple locations on every floor. So the access to outside space is a very important feature today of wellness in the workplace. The use of glass and clear glass and bringing light into the interior cores of spaces has been a method of attracting tenants in the market and differentiating buildings. Floor to floor heights are getting higher, looking to get 10-foot clear glass at the perimeter. Again, the idea is shedding more light inside. So light and access to air, very important issues. The Chicago weather can be atrocious at times, but it's been moderating, frankly, quite a bit. And since I've been here, I've seen that the zone of time when one might use an outside space is widening. You'd be in there in May, you could be in there in April even, and you can be out there as late as October, September, October, even sometimes into November. Of course, you're going to get aberrant days when you can't get outside. But I think the trend of trading outside space for access tenants is a trend that's going to be here. It's happening with virtually every building, and it's a good thing. Air changes, all the things that are needed in new buildings to make them healthier. COVID is actually making some of that happen faster, which is, there are certain byproducts of this COVID event that are positive, and the attention to quality of air and light and security and access are some of those positive things.
Great. Well, I see that we're getting close to 1 o'clock, so I am going to ask the audience if there's any questions, submit them now. But my last question for both of you, having gone through the Great Recession, and not that COVID is the same, but my question is a lesson learned. What did you learn during 2009? Matt, I was really struck with the slides that you showed and how the supply and demand for 2009, was a negative. So when you think about what you learned responding to the 2009 Great Recession, what lesson can be applicable today with COVID?
Well, I have an observation about the two that I've said to a few people recently, and that is that those of us who were through the Great Recession, 2007 to 2009, will remember the phrases extend and pretend and kick the can down the road. And the equivalent today, in both a medical sense and an economic sense, is flatten the curve. They're the same thing. It is reduce the level of pain, but have that level of pain over a longer period of time, and not to diminish or trivialize the medical implications of it. Financially, economically, and therefore in the real estate business, what that means is that we're going to be in this position for a longer period of time than we care to, than is comfortable for sure. And at the end of it all, we'll look back and maybe be able to make the call as to whether we would have been better off having a high level of pain for a short period of time, even if that was catastrophic pain, or having this somewhat lesser level of pain for a longer period of time. And so I think the lesson learned is we're just going to have to be patient and flexible, because every day we're learning a little bit more about what's going on. And in this case, unfortunately, because it's medically induced or pandemic induced, we do not have a good historical frame of reference on which to draw lessons as to how to react and how to prepare. We're learning every day. So patience and flexibility are the two takeaways I would have.
Very, very good advice. Bob?
Well, I think I would agree that we're in this for a lot longer than we ever anticipated. It's kind of like when you discover a real defect in a project and the scope of repairs of it, kind of suddenly they start out this big and they eventually are this big. And so I think that we've already missed the boat on the, take the sharp pain and then have it tail off. We're actually in the midst of the sharp pain now, I think. Unfortunately, I think in the United States, and I'm not going to get political because I think there's been very vast mistakes made on all fronts on that area. We didn't do the right things when we should have done them very early that could have had a material impact on this outcome. And unfortunately, it's now running wild in our country, and we're going to see a lot more pain and suffering for a lot longer period of time. I think Bill Gates did it in his TED Talk in 2015. Said basically this country spends trillions of dollars preparing not to fight a war, a global war. We don't spend money preparing to deal with the enemy that is really the one that could really take us into a realm of pain that no one ever really wants to admit. And so preparedness going forward, I think, is going to be the catchword, that we all are going to have to be personally prepared to do the right things in order to stay healthy when these kinds of events occur. And hopefully our leadership will look back on the history of the playbooks that were written in the early 2000s up until the most recent administration. There were playbooks around this question that were simply ignored by everybody. And had we curtailed travel quickly, and had we really stayed with a national plan of staying in place and using masks and all the things we've been talking about, we wouldn't be seeing the number of deaths we've seen today and the rapid rise in cases. And I think in the real estate world, we're going to learn how to address these issues from this event in many ways, about the ways buildings are going to be built, how security is going to work, and how transportation is going to work. And from this, we'll learn a lot and hopefully be better prepared in the future for one of these events. They predicted this one and it's here, and there'll be more. So we should be very vigilant and not let history evaporate or become forgetful of what's happened. There's been more people who have lost their lives in this event by a factor of 3 than died in Vietnam. So this is a big one.
Well, that's a heavy note to conclude, but it's something that we should all take to heart. And I want to thank both of you for joining us today and helping our members hear directly from you that you've got your finger on the pulse of what's happening with commercial and residential real estate. I hope you'll join us again, because as you've both noted, we're still a lot unknown and we're still very much in the beginning of this. So I will expect that maybe before the year end, we'll regroup and kind of touch base on where things stand and where, with the new information that we have in just a short period of time, what you think the future will continue to look like. So I thank both of you, for being here today. For our CCAC members, please note that we do not have an August meeting. That's tradition for CCAC. So we will resume again the second Tuesday of September. I believe that's September 8th. Watch your emails for notices to register. We will have program details out in the end of August, early September on that. We will continue to have the webinar series on Tuesdays and Thursdays through the end of July and resume those again in September. We are working in collaboration with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago and the Alliance for Regional Development, and we will have a 2020 summit on regional competitiveness the week of November 16th. You may recall we announced that the summit was originally going to be held on Monday, November 16th, but the bank has concluded that it will not have any in-person conferences this year. So what we've decided to do is offer 2 hours of programming each morning the week of November 16th to talk about disruption, driving innovation, embracing economic change in the new decade and in the new world of COVID. So there's a lot to look forward to. I wish all of you to stay well, stay strong. Thank you for your support of CCAC. Please continue to provide feedback of how the organization can bring value to the work that you do. And Matt and Bob, thank you for your time today. Look forward to talking to you both soon. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.